On a country road, you encounter a strange vagrant, his wool sweater buttoned to the top in the summer heat. As night falls, it is revealed that his skin is covered in a myriad of images that he claims depict the future and the past. As he begins to fall asleep, he warns you not to stare for too long, as the images are known to move and to act out stories. Do not watch for too long, or you may become part of The Illustrated Man by Ray Bradbury, published in 1951 by Doubleday, is a collection of 18 short stories, loosely connected via a frame story, which is the titular Illustrated Man. I enjoyed this collection quite a bit. As you can see, I got it from the library. I'm not a huge fan of trying to own every book that I've ever read. I think that's a little bit counterintuitive. I think that you can read books more than once, but I think the books that you decide to own should be those that you are lending out on a regular basis, those that are very interesting to people who enjoy the same genres as you. The Illustrated Man, I think, is a great example of the frame story, as we said. But it's also a great example of a book that, even though I don't own it, I want to own it, because there are examples of short stories in this collection that are people of the general public, even those who don't necessarily like sci-fi fiction, would benefit from having read. Kaleidoscope is a great character study. One of the biggest criticisms I have of this collection is that the thinking is quite antiquated. As I said, it was published in 1951, and scientific understanding has advanced quite a bit since then, which, of its time, it's a very interesting thing, but there's things that, like the rocket equation, which, if you're not familiar with the rocket equation, it's this idea that when you have a rocket that has liquid fuel, chemical rockets as they're known, it takes more fuel to carry the fuel that you're carrying to carry the fuel. So at a certain point, you can't really carry any more fuel effectively. It's like a dwindling returns equation there. But there's that antiquated type of thinking. But I think it's more of a character study or a humanities study. One of the descriptions I read online in kind of doing some poking around and researching after having read it. I try not to read too much about books. I don't want that to ruin it. At the beginning of this one, there's this opening by Ray Bradbury where he talks about kind of how he wrote these stories, and it starts to kind of, I hadn't read it. Hadn't read any of the stories, and they're fairly famous. Kaleidoscope being one of the more famous ones. I hadn't read it, and so he's talking about it. I don't want anything to ruin anything. But a lot of these stories were written in basically a day. He describes that he started writing them in the morning. They came as an idea. He started writing them around 9, 10 in the morning, and they were finished by lunch and or mid-dinner time. They're really character studies, and there's a lot of humanity, and you can kind of tell that there are 1950s sensibilities, 1940s sensibilities, values from that time. Speaking of antiquated thinking, he describes a lot of scenes where rockets just land, which is just like, all right, we figured out how to land rockets, and then they can just take right off. It's this idea. There's a lot that goes into rockets, it turns out, that we just barely understood just how to shoot them into the air, let alone and not land them. In fact, land them so explosively, some would say. Another example of antiquated thinking is aliens from Venus or aliens from the gas giant planets in our solar system. The gravity on the gas giants is so immense that any living thing would be crushed, at least in any conception that we have of living thing. That's a basic understanding of it. But basically, his description of people from Saturn and Jupiter are just like, they're people walking around, and they came here, and it's like, oh, hey, Bob, the Jupiter person, It's funny. It's just, but that's not what this is about. This is about the storytelling. And Ray Bradbury does an excellent job of telling a story and keeping you invested. And especially because they're short stories, you have to be kind of hooked from the get-go. I like short story fiction, especially in sci-fi. I recently went to a half-price bookstore and found a bunch of old sci-fi short story magazines like Asimov's and amazing science fiction, things like that, analog science fiction. I love that kind of stuff. This is a great, they're classics for sure. These are short story sci-fi classics for sure. A nice blend of warm humanity with the cold logic of technology. I read that somewhere. That's not my thing. It's a nice blend of the two. It's definitely an interesting character study in how those two aspects of our modern society would blend in the predicted future of the time. In the edition that I read, there was a story omitted called The Fire Balloons. I did not read this story. I finished the book and decided not to do any more reading after that because I had moved on to another book. But it was replaced with a story called The Illustrated Man, which kind of ties together the story, the frame story. And I think it was a fitting conclusion. It was a nice little way of tying things together. Each story, the stories have nothing to do with each other. So it's different from Hyperion in that way. Those stories kind of flow together into one narrative that it continues on. In high school, I read Fahrenheit 451. I really enjoyed that. There is a story in this called The Exiles that has a similar trope of censorship. It's not the same in any other way. It's kind of weird. You'll see in a little bit when I show which stories I liked and which ones I didn't really like, where it falls. But, there's kind of the small little nugget of that idea here. By my calculations, this book that I read, the version that I read, is 274 pages, split between 18 stories. That is 15.2 pages per story. I don't know who cares about that, but I'm here to calculate those numbers for whoever cares about that. All right, and to the individual short stories I'm going to show you right now. All of my favorite short stories are going to be in green. The ones that I thought were kind of middle of the road were going to be yellow, and the ones I did not enjoy are going to be in red. So check that out. Pause the screen if you'd like to read those. And we're going to be moving on to notable favorites. There are two stories. I think I'll do this when I do a short story collection. There are two stories that I think are my favorites. Maybe not the best, but my favorites. I got a shout out to Kaleidoscope. I think people pretty roundly agree that that's one of the better stories in this collection. It's very interesting, very dark, very interesting that kids read it in middle and high school. I did not read this in high school, but I think I would have really enjoyed it if I had read it. And it may have sparked that sci-fi love in my brain, but I honestly don't know. My other notable favorite is The Highway. I like this story. It's a small little story, and it kind of plays with the idea of perspective. And that's all I'm really going to say. If you want to read it, you can go ahead and check that out. You can read most of these stories individually online. Again, I got this book from the library. Check out your local library. Please use your libraries. They're great. You can do paper books. You can do ebooks, you can do audiobooks, all free of charge. In fact, you already pay for it because that's what the library is. And finally, we're going to say that I give this short story collection, The Illustrated Man, I'm going to give it 14 illustrated men out of 18. And, there are some really good stories in here. There's a little bit of antiquated thinking. I don't necessarily knock the antiquated thinking against the rating. It's just kind of, there's some stories that don't really hit for me. There's, I don't know. I think that sensibilities and values have really shifted, and that's the thing. Those are the things that really knock it down a few for me. There are some stories that kind of meh. I feel like if this was 14 short stories, it would be way better. It would be a 14 out of 14 Illustrated Men. But I love short story collections. Please leave a comment below to tell me which collection I should read next. For example, 2 that I am definitely going to read into the future. I have other ones on the list, but these are 2 that probably the next 2 that I'm going to read. I'm going to be doing I, Robot, which I've never read before. And I'm going to be doing City by Clifford Simak. So if you have any other suggestions, please leave a comment, like, and subscribe. And I will see you guys on the next one.